All right, let's talk about unlocking the real power of AWS API Gateway. And we're going to do it with a bit of a twist. We are completely ditching the AWS console. Instead, we'll be defining everything, everything, from security to the backend logic directly inside our open API definitions. So let's just dive in and see how this all works.
So if you've ever had to build an API on AWS, you probably know this dance all too well, right? You get your API structure all nice and neat in an open API or Swagger file, but then the real work begins. You got to jump into the AWS console and start clicking and clicking and clicking, setting up all that crucial stuff like Lambda integrations, authorizers, maybe some VPC links. It's just so manual. It's super easy to make a mistake, and trying to keep it all under version control, forget about it.
But what if there was a better way? What if you could just declare all of that AWS-specific stuff right inside your standard open API file? Well, guess what? You absolutely can. This is where AWS's special vendor extensions come into play. You'll see them all start with X-Amazon-API Gateway. Think of these as the magic bridge, connecting the standard generic open API spec to all the powerful, specific features of API Gateway. This is how you get to true infrastructure as code for your APIs.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll touch on the main problem we're solving. Then, we'll jump into 3 toolkits of these extensions, one for security, one for backend integration, and one for custom behaviors. And we'll spend a little extra time on what I like to call the master key that really unlocks everything.
All right, so here's the core dilemma. The standard open API specification, it's meant to be universal, right? It knows how to describe resources, paths, and data models, but it has no clue what an AWS Lambda function is, or an Amazon Cognito user pool. It's just not in its vocabulary. So these extensions are basically AWS's way of teaching Open API to speak AWS. You get to embed all that service-specific knowledge right into your spec, creating one single source of truth for your entire API definition. It's a game changer.
Let's kick things off with our first toolkit, and this one is all about security. Instead of clicking around in the IAM console or the API Gateway console, we can define our entire security posture right here, declaratively. You can think about this in a few layers. First up, we decide if and how we're even using API keys. Second, we can set a broad authorization type for a particular method. And then finally, for that really granular control, we can define and attach a custom authorizer. So step 1 is pretty simple. This property, X-Amazon API Gateway API key source, just tells API Gateway where it should look for the API key. You'll set it to header if you expect the key in the standard X API key header, which is the most common case. Or you could set it to authorizer if a Lambda authorizer is going to be providing it. Next up, for each and every method in your API, you can set the authorization type. Using this X-Amazon API Gateway auth object, you can specify none, for a totally public, unsecured endpoint, or you can set it to AWS IAM to enforce that the caller has to have valid AWS credentials that are signed with SigV4, which is Amazon's protocol for authenticating API requests. Now for the really powerful security tool, the X-Amazon API Gateway Authorizer. This is where you define things like your Lambda authorizers or your Cognito user pools. What's super interesting here is the difference in the type property. For the older REST APIs, your options are token, request, or Cognito user pools. But for the newer, faster HTTP APIs, things are a lot more streamlined. Your options are just request for a Lambda or JWT for native JWT validation. Okay, and here's what that actually looks like in practice. Check out this code. We're setting up a Lambda authorizer for a good old REST API. See that? The type is set to token. Then you've got the authorizer URI, which is just pointing straight to the ARN of our Lambda function. The one that's going to run all our custom logic. And finally, identity source. That's just telling API Gateway, hey, go grab the authorization header and pass it to my function. Simple, clean, all there in the code. Okay, so our API is secure. Now what? Well, let's connect it to a backend. This is pretty much the whole point of API Gateway, and our second toolkit is going to handle exactly that. The type property inside the integration object is where all the magic happens. AWS Proxy is probably the one you'll see the most for serverless apps. It just passes the whole request straight to a Lambda function. AWS is for direct integrations with other AWS services. HTTP Proxy is for passing requests through to another HTTP API. And Mock. Mock is fantastic for development. It lets you return a static response without needing any backend at all. Now, All those different integration types we just talked about, they all live inside one single, super powerful object, X Amazon API Gateway integration. Seriously, if you remember one thing, remember this one. I call it the master key because it is the most critical extension you're going to use. It defines, down to the last detail, exactly how API Gateway is going to talk to your backend. So let's look at this example. This little snippet shows an AWS type integration that's connecting to a Lambda. And notice the HTTP method is set to post. That's a requirement for invoking Lambdas. And the URI points directly to the ARN of our function. This right here is the declarative link between our API endpoint and the code that's actually going to run.
So to break that down even more, here are the essential properties you need to know. We've already covered type, URI, and HTTP method. Credentials lets you specify an IAM role that API Gateway will assume to get permission to call your backend. Connection type is absolutely crucial for private APIs. You'll set that to VPC link to connect to resources inside your VPC. And for HTTP APIs that use Lambda, payload format version lets you pick between the classic 1.0 event structure or the newer, simpler 2.0 format.
All right, on to our final toolkit. This one covers all the finishing touches. These are the extensions that handle those cross-cutting concerns and let you really fine-tune the behavior of your entire API Gateway deployment. You know, anyone who's ever had to manually configure cores knows what a pain it is. Setting up that separate options method just for pre-flight requests? Ugh. Well, for HTTP APIs, this xamazon-API gateway.cores object is a total lifesaver. You can define your entire course policy, allowed origins, methods, headers, the whole shebang, in this one clean object right at the top of your OpenAPI file. Another really cool customization is how you can handle gateway-level errors. So instead of getting those default AWS error messages, you can use xAmazon API gateway responses to map standard error types like default 4xx for client errors or maybe invalid API key to your own custom status codes and even branded JSON response bodies.
Okay, so let's put it all together. Look at this. It all just connects. Up at the top, we define our Lambda authorizer in the security schemes. Then, down in the actual path definition, our endpoint just references that authorizer by its name. And right below that, there it is, our xAmazon API Gateway integration object, linking it all to the backend Lambda, so you've got security, routing, and your backend logic all defined together in one file that you can check in to Git. That is the power of a fully declarative API. So really, the big takeaway here is this. These extensions let you pull your API Gateway configuration out of the console and put it where it belongs, right in your codebase. Now it can be versioned in Git, you can review it in pull requests, and you can deploy it automatically through your CI/CD pipelines. It really does fundamentally change how you manage your APIs on AWS. So I guess the only question left is, what are you going to automate first?